This chapter is called The Palace. By Gundrops, whispered the big friendly giant. Is this really it? There's the palace, Sophie whispered back. Not more than 100 yards away, through the tall trees in the garden, across the mown lawns and tidy flower beds, the massive shape of the palace itself loomed through the darkness. It was made of whitish stone. The sheer size of it staggered the BFG. But this place is having 100 bedrooms at least, he said. Easily, I should think, Sophie whispered. Then I is boggled, the BFG said. How is I possibly finding the one where the queen is sleeping? Let's go. Chew with your mouth shut. Let's go a bit closer and have a look, Sophie whispered. The BFG glided forward among the trees. Suddenly he stopped dead. The great ear in which Sophie was sitting began to swivel around. Hey, Sophie whispered, you're going to tip me out. Shh, the BFG whispered back. I is hearing something. He stopped behind a clump of bushes. He waited. The ear was still swinging this way and that. Sophie had to hang on tight to the side of it to save herself from tumbling out. The BFG pointed through a gap in the bushes, and there, not more than 50 yards away, she saw a man padding softly across the lawn. He had a guard dog with him on a leash. The BFG stayed still as a stone. So did Sophie. The man and the dog walked on and disappeared into the darkness. You was telling me that they has no soldiers in the back garden? The BFG whispered. He wasn't a soldier, whispered Sophie. He was some sort of watchman. We'll have to be careful. I is not too worried, the BFG said. These waxy big ears of mine is picking up even the noise of a man breathing on the other side of this garden. How much longer before it begins to get light? Sophie whispered. Very short, the BFG said. We must go pell-mell for leather now. He glided forward through the vast garden, and once again Sophie noticed how he seemed to melt into the shadows wherever he went. His feet made no sound at all, even when he was walking on gravel. Suddenly they were right up close against the back wall of the great palace. The BFG's head was level with the upper windows, one flight up, and Sophie, sitting in his ear, had the same view. And all the windows on that floor, the curtains seemed to be drawn. There were no lights showing anywhere. In the distance, they could hear the muted sound of traffic going around Hyde Park Corner. The BFG stopped and put his other ear, the one Sophie wasn't sitting in, close to the first window. No, he whispered. What are you listening for? Sophie whispered back. Read.
You're going to lose story time. You're bugging me. Stop.
For breathing, the BFG said. I is able to tell if it is a man, human being, or a lady by the breathing voice. He was a man in there, snortling a little bit too. He glided on, flattened his tall, thin, black cloaked body against the side of the building. He came to the next window. He listened. No, he whispered. He moved on. This room is empty, he whispered. He listened at several more windows, but at each one he shook his head and moved on. When he came to the window at the very center of the palace, he listened, but did not move on. Ho, ho, he whispered. We has a lady sleeping in there. Sophie felt a little quiver go running down her spine. But who? She whispered back. The BFG put a finger to his lips for silence. He reached up through the window and parted the curtains ever so slightly. The orange glow from the night sky over London crept into the room and cast a glimmer of light onto its walls. It was a large room, a lovely room, a rich carpet, gilded chairs, a dressing table, a bed, and on the pillow of the bed lay the head of a sleeping woman. Sophie suddenly found herself looking at the face she had seen on stamps and coins and in the newspaper all her life. For a few seconds she was speechless. Is that her? The BFG whispered. Yes, Sophie whispered back. The BFG wasted no time. First, and very carefully, he started to raise the lower half of the large window. The BFG was an expert on windows. He had opened thousands of them over the years to blow his dreams into children's bedrooms. But some windows got stuck. Some were wobbly, some creaked. He was pleased to find that the Queen's window slid upward like silk. Gray, up here.
Get up.
He pushed the lower half as far as it would go, so as to leave it in place on the sill for Sophie to sit. Next, he closed the crack in the curtains. Then Then, with finger and thumb, he lifted Sophie out of his ear and placed her on the window ledge, with her legs dangling just inside the room, but behind the curtains. Now, don't you go toppling backwards, the BFG whispered. You must always be holding on tight with both hands to the inside of the windowsill. Sophie did as he said. It was summertime in London, and the night was not cold, but don't forget that Sophie was wearing only her thin nightie. She would have given anything for a dressing gown, not just to keep warm, but to hide the whiteness of her nightie from the watchful eyes in the garden below. The BFG was taking the glass jar from the pocket of his cloak. He unscrewed the lid. Now, very cautiously, he poured the precious dream into the wide end of his trumpet. He steered the trumpet through the curtains, far into the room, aiming at the place where he knew the bed to be. He took a deep breath, he puffed out his cheeks, and poof! He blew. Now he was withdrawing the trumpet, sliding it out very carefully like a thermometer. Is you all right sitting there? He whispered. Yes, here's a picture. Here's a picture. Yes, Sophie murmured. She was quite terrified, but determined not to show it. She looked down over her shoulder. The ground seemed miles away. It was a nasty drop. How long will the dream take to work? Sophie whispered. Some takes an hour, the BFG whispered back. Some is quicker. Some is slower still. But it is sure to find her in the end. Sophie said nothing. I is going off to wait in the garden, the BFG whispered. When you is wanting me, just call out my name and I is coming very quick. Will you hear me? Sophie whispered. You is forgetting these, the BFG whispered, smiling and pointing to his great ears. Goodbye, Sophie whispered. Suddenly, unexpectedly, the BFG leaned forward and kissed her gently on the cheek. Sophie felt like crying. When she turned to look at him, he was already gone. He had simply melted away into the dark garden. Another chapter. You guys up for it?
Can you guys handle that?
Yes.
Okay.
You okay? Trying to be good?
Yes.
The Queen. Dawn came at last, and the rim of a lemon-colored sun rose up behind the rooftop somewhere behind Victoria Station. A while later, Sophie felt a little of its warmth on her back, and was grateful. In the distance, she heard a church clock striking. She counted the strikes. There were 7. Does that mean it's 7 in the morning?
Yes.
She found it almost impossible to believe that she, Sophie, a little orphan of no real importance in the world, was at this moment actually sitting high above the ground on the windowsill of the Queen of England's bedroom, with the Queen herself asleep in there behind the curtain and not more than 5 yards away. The very idea was absurd. No one had ever done such a thing, and it was a terrifying thing to be doing. What would happen if the dream didn't work? No one, least of all the Queen, would believe a word of her story. It seemed possible that nobody had ever woken up to find a small child sitting behind the curtains on his or her windowsill. The Queen was bound to get a shock. Who wouldn't? With all the patience of a small girl who has something important to wait for, Sophie sat motionless on the windowsill. How much longer, she wondered. What time do queens wake up? Faint stirrings and distant sounds came to her from deep inside the belly of the palace. Then, all at once, behind the curtain, she heard a voice of the sleeper in the bedroom, with the slightly blurred sleep-talker's voice. "Oh, no!" it cried out. "No, don't! Someone stop them! Don't let them do it! I can't bear it! Oh, please stop them! It's horrible! Oh, it's ghastly! No, no, no!" She is having the dream, Sophie told herself. It must be really horrid. I feel so sorry for her, but it has to be done. After that, there were a few moans, then there was a long silence. Sophie waited. She looked over her shoulder. She was terrified that she would see the man with the dog down in the garden staring up at her, but the garden was deserted. A pale summer mist hung over it like smoke. It was an enormous garden, very beautiful, with a large, funny-shaped lake at the far end. There was an island on the lake, and there were ducks swimming in the water. Inside the room, beyond the curtains, Sophie suddenly heard what was obviously a knock on the door. She heard the doorknob being turned. She heard someone entering the room. Good morning, Your Majesty, a woman was saying. It was the voice of an oldish person. There was a pause, and then the rattle of china and silver. Will you have your tray on the bed, ma'am, or on the table? Oh, Mary! Something awful just happened. This was a voice Sophie had heard many times on the radio and television, especially on Christmas Day. It was a very well-known voice. Whatever is it, ma'am? I've just had the most frightful dream. It was a nightmare. It was awful. Oh, I am sorry, ma'am. But don't be distressed. You're awake now. It will go away. It was only a dream, ma'am. Do you know what I dreamt, Mary? I dreamt that little girls and boys were being snatched out of their beds at boarding school and were being eaten by the most ghastly giants. The giants were putting their arms in through the dormitory windows and plucking the children out with their fingers. One lot from a girls' school and another from a boys' school. It was all so vivid, Mary. It was so real. There was a silence. Sophie waited. She was quivering with excitement. But why the silence? Why didn't the other one, the maid, why didn't she say something? What on earth's the matter, Mary? The famous voice was saying. There was another silence. Mary, you've gone white as a sheet. Are you feeling ill? Suddenly there was a crash and clatter of crockery, which could have only meant that the tray the maid was carrying had fallen out of her hands. Mary, the famous voice was saying rather sharply, I think you'd better sit down at once. You look as though you're going to faint. You really mustn't take it so hard, because I've had an awful dream. That wasn't the reason, ma'am. The maid's voice was quivering terribly. Then for heaven's sake, what is the reason? I'm very sorry about the tray, ma'am. Oh, don't worry about the tray. What on earth was it that made you drop it? Why did you go white as a ghost all of a sudden? You haven't seen the papers yet, have you, ma'am? No. What do they say? Sophie heard the rustling of a newspaper as it was being handed over. It's like the very dream you had in the night, ma'am. Rubbish, Mary. Where is it? On the front page, ma'am. It's the big headlines. Great Scott! Cried the famous voice. 18 girls vanished mysteriously from their beds at Rodian School. 14 boys disappeared from Eton. Bones are found underneath dormitory windows. Whoa. Then there was a pause, punctuated by gasps from the famous voice as the newspaper article was clearly being read and digested. Oh, how ghastly, the famous voice cried out. It's absolutely frightful. Bones under the windows. What can have happened? Oh, those poor children. But, ma'am, don't you see, ma'am? See what, Mary? Those children were taken away almost exactly as you dreamt it, ma'am. Not by giants, Mary. No, ma'am. But the bit about the girls and boys disappearing from their dormitories, you dreamt it so clearly, and then it actually happened. That's why I came over all queer, ma'am. I'm coming over a bit queer myself, Mary. It gives me the shakes, ma'am. When something like this happens, it really does. I don't blame you, Mary. I shall get you some more breakfast, ma'am, and I'll have this mess cleared up. No, don't go, Mary. Stay a moment. Sophie wished she could see the room, but she didn't dare touch the curtains. The famous voice began speaking again. I really did dream about those children, Mary. It was crystal clear. I know you did, ma'am. I don't know how giants got into it. That was rubbish. Shall I draw the curtains, ma'am? And then we shall all feel better? It's a lovely day. Please do. With a swish, the great curtains were pulled aside. The maid screamed. Sophie froze on the window ledge. The queen, sitting up in her bed with the Times in her lap, that's the newspaper, glanced up sharply. Now it was her turn to freeze. She didn't scream as the maid had done. Queens are too self-controlled for that. She simply sat there, staring wide-eyed and white-faced at the small girl who was perched on her windowsill in a nightie. Sophie was petrified. Curiously enough, the queen looked petrified too. One would have expected her to look surprised, as you or I would have done when we discovered a small girl sitting on our windowsill first thing in the morning. But the queen didn't look surprised. She looked genuinely frightened.
Was this genuinely Me.
Truly frightened.
Here's a picture.
Well, that was a good chapter.
You want to see the picture, Ray?
Okay. Mary looks weird.
That's the queen.
Can I see?
I'll show you in a second.
Okay.
A queen. The queen.
Oh, yeah, right. That is Mary. You're right. That's the maid.
Me.